Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
Welcome aboard. Summertime. Even though it's not officially here on the calendar, it's 91 degrees out there now.
I was just going to say, it sure feels like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to summertime. Ron Finn and Shayne Stanfield at your service for this hour of Faith with Reasons as we come to you, let's see, for show number 447.
And counting.
Already on the very last day of May, and we're really pleased to have one of our favorite guests back on. It's been too long since Karlo Broussard has joined us. In fact, last time we chatted with Karlo, his book, Meeting the Protestant Response, How to Answer Common Comebacks to Catholic Arguments. It was a great conversation. It's a terrific book. Mm-hmm. And we're pleased to have him back on to talk about his new book, which just came out recently on Catholic Answers Press. It's called The New Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists. And I saw this when it was coming out, just before it came out, and I reached out to Karlo because this is something. Talk about, I don't know how, I'll have to ask him that, but how do you write a book that's going to hit at exactly the right time for what we all need? And that's pretty much what happens with this book. So can't wait to talk to him. Karlo, of course, a native of southern Louisiana, but he left a promising musical career to devote himself to full-time work of Catholic apologetics. And, of course, you know Karlo well as a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, traveling the country and the world, giving talks on apologetics, biblical studies, theology, and philosophy. Of course, he's published a variety of articles on a variety of subjects, too. You'll find his writings not only at your favorite Catholic bookstore and in one of the many books he's written, but also articles in Catholic Answers magazine, and, of course, a regular guest on Catholic Answers Live, and an active writer for Catholic Answers magazine online at Catholic.com. Now, Karlo holds an undergraduate and graduate degree in theology from Catholic Distance University and the Augustine Institute, and he has a master's in philosophy from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. He's also worked for several years in an apprenticeship with nationally known author and theologian Father Robert Spitzer. Yes, at the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. Karlo is one of the most dynamic and gifted Catholic speakers on the circuit today, communicating with precision of thought, a genuine love for God, and an enthusiasm that inspires. And I can attest to that because it's always a lively conversation whenever we are blessed to have Karlo Broussard joining us on Faith with Reasons. Karlo, good afternoon. Thanks for being here.
Ron and Shayne, good afternoon to both of you, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Karlo. This is a treat. Once again, a blessing for you to be here with us. And looks like an awesome book.
Same for me. I look forward to chatting with you guys about it.
Now, you're not in Louisiana now, are you?
No, sir. I am in Southern California.
And then
here at the head Catholic Answers headquarters.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. And but you're all over the place all the time. So where are you headed next, and when?
Yeah. So one of my roles here at Catholic Answers as a Catholic Answers apologist is a speaker. So I do travel and give talks and lectures and parish missions and all of that good stuff throughout the country. I was recently in Austin, Texas, giving some talks for a Legatus group and a Catholic professionals business group. I'm heading to Tyler, Texas in July, as well as Illinois in July to give some presentations. I've also been doing some traveling to Ireland because I'm currently working on my dissertation, my doctorate in philosophy through St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland. So I've been doing some traveling there as well, meeting with my professor and working on my dissertation, which I'll defend this time next year. Thanks be to God willing. So looking forward to that. Yeah, so a bit of traveling. We got some things shaking and baking on the personal end. We're actually heading to Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're going to be moving there. I'm going to be setting up shop there, still working with Catholic Answers, but also collaborating with the local diocese and the Diocese of Tulsa, doing some work there. So a lot of things moving, man, a lot of moving pieces in my life right now.
Yeah, very, very exciting times. I know when I first reached out to you when this new book had yet to hit the shelves, but it was coming, just to pin down a date that I think you were in Ireland when the book came out, weren't you? Or you were doing some traveling. So we did have to kind of go back and forth, ping pong some dates a little bit, and glad we could settle on one. And
amen.
Yeah, glad to have you on. This book had to be a joy to write, and just reading really any of your books, I mean, the reader really gets the definite sense that there was joy in writing that book. You're passionate about the subjects and about the topics, and you kind of bring us beyond the surface. So obviously, you have a gift for this.
Oh, well, thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, I must say. This was of the 5 books that I've written so far and published here at Catholic Answers Press, this was my favorite one, and it was the most fun writing because you're dealing with some of the cultural issues and knowing that it's really relevant for people in their everyday life experiences in the workplace, rubbing shoulders with the fellow barista or the person in the other cubicle, and family members and friends. Like, these are issues that people are on the ground dealing with. Mm-hmm. How do I have a conversation with somebody who has bought into critical race theory and thinks that racial inequities is a representation of racism, and the idea that to affirm objective truth is to be guilty of white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
That's essential to critical race theory. Or how do I have a conversation with my grandson who is now saying he's a girl, right? And demanding that we call him by a certain pronoun, which would be contrary to what I view reality to be. How do I navigate those waters? How do I engage in a conversation with somebody who says you're intolerant simply for me saying that, that particular lifestyle choice is not going to make you happy and it's immoral and you ought not do it. So how about you reform your ways? So these are just this is a sampling of some of the woke moral commands that our family members and friends and ourselves encounter in our everyday lives. And I'm trying to give people the intellectual tools needed to engage those woke moral commands, to expose the relativism that's lurking behind them, number one, in order to substantiate and make good on the thesis of the book, that there's this new relativism. We'll talk about that. And then also to give folks, the tools needed to refute the thinking that's behind these moral absolutes. Because as we'll talk about more in our conversation today, Ron and Shayne, on the surface, these modern moral absolutes seem good, like things we'll get on board with. But whenever you start thinking through them and you think about the modern spin that these moral commands have in our culture, you come to see very quickly that what people mean by these woke moral commands is not something that we should be getting on board with. In fact, it's something that we should reject and, in fact, expose the incoherencies and the bad thinking that's embedded in them so that people don't unsuspectingly buy into them and be drifted away with the new relativism.
And isn't that the way that they sell this typically? I mean, when you look at news or when you hear people speak about this, it's generally tugging at people's heartstrings. Well, you have a certain group over here, and because of their skin color, they're being subjected to all of this racism. So we have to develop these. I don't know what you would call it, more of a social norm. These things seem to erupt out of nowhere. These movements, Black Lives Matter and whatnot.
Right.
And they even go so far as to take advantage of rather unfortunate situations and
right.
and either twist them or exaggerate them in some way for these movements. And
yes.
and it always seems to be that, again, at least to me, and I don't know whether or not you agree totally with this, but again, it's almost intentional that we're going to tug at people's heartstrings because this should be a good thing that you should be supporting. However, what's lying under the covers here is something, like you said, entirely different.
Yes, so I would affirm 100% that they're pulling at the heartstrings, and what's lying under the covers is something totally different. With regard to the intention behind the new relativism, this masked relativism, this veiled relativism, a relativism that's couched within the verbiage of moral imperatives within our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some who are good intentioned, like they just do not see the truth of what critical race theory is, for example, and they think critical race theory equals, let's get rid of white supremacy is bad, so I'm on board with critical race theory, and failing to understand precisely what it is in its essence, right? However, I do think there are malicious people with malicious intentions who are intentionally trying to promote these woke moral commands, but intentionally buying into the relativistic thinking that's embedded within them in order to forward their false thinking and their agendas. So I think it's going to be a matter of both in and there. But with regard to pulling on the heartstrings, Shayne, you hit the nail on the head there, brother. Because one thing I point out in the book is that what all of these woke moral commands do is to try to get the person to think, well, if I'm going to affirm objective truth, or if I'm going to criticize certain people's lifestyle choices, particularly associated with the LGBTQ plus community, then I'm somehow a bad person.
Yeah.
And that's pulling at the heartstrings because, let's face it, guys, nobody in their heart of hearts wants to be a bad guy. Nobody wants to be a bad person. We don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to be evil today, right?
Right.
And so this is an ingenious plan by the evil one, right? What better way to get somebody to embrace relativistic thinking, which necessarily means I must reject Jesus Christ and Christianity, than to think that by embracing objective truth, I'm somehow an evil person, a bad person, not a nice person. And it's an ingenious plan, but it's our job as evangelists, as Christians, to help people to break the spell of that illusion, right? To help people see that, no, man, what these woke moral commands are doing is what these woke moral commands involve is things contrary to our reason, things that are incoherent, things that are insane. And hopefully, if we can just fan the flame of reason just a little bit, reason will come to acknowledge and recognize the absurdity of these woke moral commands and reject it. And I'm optimistic enough, Ron and Shayne, that there are enough people out there, the average Joe Blow in the street, that the family member and the friend who's working in as a barista in the coffee shop. There's enough people out there that once you expose the truth of these woke moral commands and really what's behind the modern spin or behind the veil, they'll come to see its absurdity and reject it.
And Karlo Broussard, our guest here on Faith with Reasons, we've always kind of done battle with kind of relativism in a certain sense. We've always talked ourselves in. We've sold ourselves bills of goods in the past, but it seems like that was benign compared to what we're faced with today, especially with these well-funded groups that push specific agendas. In the book, you kind of you draw the distinction between, quote, the old relativism and the new relativism. Can you expound on that a little bit, the difference between the two?
Sure. Yeah, so relativism in general is just a philosophical worldview that there is no absolute truth. And then, of course, you have different partial forms of that where it's more restrictive and saying, well, there might be some truth in science and math, but no truth when it comes to morality. So the old relativism, Ron and Shayne, was in your face. It was blatant. It was right there for you to see, no hiddenness to it whatsoever. People went around saying, you have your truth, I have mine, right? And anytime you tried to articulate a position or critique a position, the response was always, well, that's your truth, I have my truth. Mm-hmm. And it was in your face. And people were promoting that as a viable option for us to embrace and live our lives by, because that was the nice thing to do. And it also, secondly, had a tone of niceness to it, right? Relativism, if you want to be the nice guy, you got to buy into relativism. So relativism created this vacuum of no truth, right? And how are we going to go living about our lives with no truth? But in comes the new relativism to fill in that vacuum, Where the old relativism, because it's been refuted time and time again by apologists, right, and its absurdity has been shown forth, the light has been shown upon the old relativism, and that relativism has been exposed for its insanity and absurdity, that old relativism was now swept underneath the rug, or at least veiled and covered with the verbiage of these woke moral commands. But what you find is that this old relativism, this relativism is not dead or passé, which you might think it is, given the fact that we live in what some have called the Shayne culture, a culture in which no one can violate the moral imperatives of inclusion and tolerance, right? Mm-hmm. And if you do, you're ousted, man. You're going to have some negative consequences for your bad behavior and conflicting with the cultural norms. So how can you be a relativist in such a culture? How can our culture be relativistic in a culture that's shaming everybody for their bad behavior? And you would think that relativism is dead. But when you scratch the surface, as I show in the 10 chapters of my book, behind these woke moral commands, what you find is good old-fashioned relativism. Mm-hmm. Whether it's in the total form, there is no absolute truth, or whether it's in the moral form, there's no absolute moral truth. And so the new relativism is relativism, but hidden. So there's a hiddenness to it that makes it new. And secondly, what makes it new, unlike the old, the new relativism is more militant. Rather than it having a tone of niceness to it, it's more militant now, kind of like the new atheism was, more of a militant atheism. Mm-hmm. The new relativism is, rather than you have your truth, I have mine, that was the nice old relativism. The new relativism is you can't have your truth, and you must conform to mine. And so that's sort of the two main characteristics of the quote-unquote new relativism. And it makes it more difficult to refute because your starting point are these modern moral absolutes which have of the verbiage of absolutism. You can't be a white supremacist. You can't be intolerant. You can't misinform. You shouldn't be anti-science. You shouldn't be a judgmental, hateful bigot, right? Mm. But whenever you begin to inquire as to what these commands mean and unspin, the modern spin, it becomes very evident. It becomes evident very quickly that there's relativistic thinking embedded in the modern moral commands. So what I do in the book is I go through 10 of these woke moral commands, expose the relativism embedded within it, refute the relativistic thinking, and give you strategies as to how to refute, how to engage in conversations and refute these modern commands.
So refuting traditional relativism, I guess let's start with that. And there's one that I distinctly remember, and I'm hoping that you can expound on this or even add more. I mean, relativism in its sense, or its basic, is self-refuting, because if there is no truth, that statement itself is not true, or can't possibly, or is true, but it can't possibly be true because you're stating that there's no truth.
That's right. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up, Shayne, because in the book I have 3 sections where I go into good old-fashioned relativism, right? Mm-hmm. Total relativism, like there is no absolute truth. Moral relativism, there's no absolute moral truth. And cultural relativism, truth is dependent upon, rather than the individual, the group of individuals, the society or the culture. And so I do have strategies as to how to refute just straight-up relativism. Mm-hmm. So you brought up total relativism. There is no absolute truth. So the common strategy employed to refute that is to basically ask the question, well, is that statement itself absolutely true?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If the individual says, no, it's not absolutely true, in order to try and stay consistent with relativism, mm-hmm. well, then they've just falsified their position. They falsified total relativism, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if the individual says, yes, it is absolutely true, well, then they're also falsifying relativism, because there's at least one absolute truth, namely the statement or the belief there is no absolute truth. Mm-hmm. And so total relativism is self-referentially incoherent. That is, when you apply the meaning of total relativism to itself, it can't pass its own test, right?
Yeah.
It can't pass its own test because it's asserting an objective truth in as much as it's even making the claim there is no absolute truth. So that's how we would refute old-fashioned relativism that's in your face, right? But watch this. In modern times, we have this new relativism embedded within critical race theory, which says you can't be a white supremacist. Okay, well, that sounds like a good thing. Like, yeah, we can get on board with that. But then we have to ask the question, well, what do certain people in our modern culture mean by white supremacy? Well, in critical race theory, one of the essential characteristics of a white supremacist culture is objectivity, objective truth.
Wow.
Being able to know what things are independent of a particular group of people or a particular person at a time in history in some place. Objectivity, according to critical race theory, is the ideologue of racism. So to affirm objective truth is to be a white supremacist.
Wow.
Now, if you think about that, you think to yourself, well, wait a minute, so affirming objective truth, that's a bad thing, right? Yeah. Well, don't you need objective truth in order to say that something is bad? Don't you need objective truth in order to critique white supremacy? And the answer is yes, you do, right? And so notice they're trying to affirm the badness of white supremacy while at the same time saying there is no objective truth, which is what you need in order to affirm the badness of white supremacy. So therein you have, once again, a self-referential incoherence. You have a self-refuting idea even within these woke moral commands. But on the surface, it doesn't seem to be so. But once you pull back the veil and unmask the woke command, you discover that, once again, it's just good old-fashioned total relativism, and it's incoherent. So they're pulling the rug out from underneath their feet.
Wow.
And even back in the day, Pope Benedict XVI warned that relativism was a dictatorship that threatened all our freedoms, and no truer words were ever spoken.
Absolutely. And what I will try to show in the book is that dictatorship of relativism is playing out in our modern culture, specifically within these woke moral commands. Because, for example, in the woke moral command, thou shalt not misinform, what that involves is anybody who offers a critical analysis of the common cultural consensus or the narrative that's constructed by the powers that be, those opposing voices are immediately silenced and canceled in the name of quote-unquote misinformation, right?
Yep.
And so what you see is that persuasion of the mind and rational debate is no longer an option. It is completely off the table. And only the powers that be who control the cultural narrative are the ones who can dictate what we must believe. Now, that is the wicked offspring of relativism, because within the mental framework of relativism, guys, listen, if there's no objective truth for our minds to conform to, then it follows that there is no longer persuasion of mind. You can't persuade minds to an objective truth if there's no objective truth for the minds to be persuaded to. And so what is left? You're only left with the power of will and the conflict of wills. And whoever has the stronger will win the day. What do we find in modern culture? Thou shalt not misinform. Any opposing view, any critical analysis of the cultural narrative constructed by the powers that be is silenced. No persuasion of mind. It is only the power of will that reigns the day. And that is relativism within modern culture. It's new relativism because it's lurking behind the absolute verbiage of thou shalt not misinform.
That's relativism on steroids. Wow. And
absolutely.
And
it's the logical consequence, right? It's the logical consequence of relativism, because we always said relativism will lead in principle to might makes right. And that is exactly what we're living out today within our culture.
Well, I don't want to jump ahead to these 10 points that you bring up here in the book, but one thing that's quite apparent to me is the detriment that this has had to science, because obviously we're seeking truth in science, but only some science is acceptable, and other science seems to be quickly squelched or even canceled. Those people that claim follow the science. They're only going by the marching orders of certain folks, but they're not taking in the consideration of the larger scientific community that might be saying something entirely different.
Exactly, Shayne, and that's exactly what I point out in the 10th chapter of my book, Thou Shalt Not Be Anti-Science. And, we've heard that ad nauseum, especially dealing with COVID-19 issues,
exactly.
Right? Particularly within the discipline of medical science, where there was an expression of a concern of an anti-science bias among Americans. And particularly, Dr. Anthony Fauci was touting that, and others along with him. But what you discover is that people were being labeled as anti-science simply for being critical of what a particular group of scientists who had, in the words of Fauci, an air of authority were saying, and not appealing to their own authority as if they were the scientific authority, which they weren't. People were just appealing to, as you put it, Shayne, other scientists, right?
Yeah.
In the wider scientific community who had differing views, which belongs to science. That's what science is about. You're going to have a difference of opinions on things. And they were simply appealing to other scientists saying, hey, listen, there are other legitimate and credible scientists who are being critical of the cultural narrative and what the consensus is among those who have, quote unquote, an area of authority. And for doing that, for offering a credible opposing view, what happened? They were labeled as being bad people. They were labeled as being anti-science, right?
Well, I was just going to say, in the case of doctors, physicians, their licenses were being threatened. They were being removed from positions in hospitals, and
absolutely,
it was nothing short of really cruel, because these people were even well written in publications and whatnot, and they were canceled overnight. And I don't recall. And again, you made an important point, because there were so many people that weren't saying that this is my opinion because, they didn't have a scientific background, or maybe very little of one. But you could look back at this as someone with common sense, and you could say, well, this isn't right because I grew up understanding how science works,
right.
and there were always competing opinions for something, and there was never really a consensus. But there was always an opportunity to challenge, and for the first time, you're witnessing worldwide entire groups of people being literally canceled, and it made no sense.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that music tells us it's time for a bit of a break, so we're going to take a short break. Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio. Karlo Broussard, our guest, and you're going to have an opportunity to kind of respond to what Shayne just said after we take this little break here. Please do come back on the other side. The book, The New Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists. We'll be right back.
The effects of abortion are greater than most people realize. It isolates, hurts families, brings about fear, sadness, and grief. It does not need to separate you from God. If you or someone you know is hurting after an abortion, please reach out to Project Rachel at 419-260-5811 or by going to hopeafterabortion.org. Nothing is too great for God's mercy. Project Rachel is here to offer confidential help on your journey to healing.
Experience the incredible story of a woman who Time magazine named the most influential Catholic woman in the United States. Rita Rizzo, the future Mother Angelica, grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Canton, Ohio during the Great Depression. Rita's father abandoned the family before she was 5 years old. Her early years of trial were compounded by a debilitating illness until she was healed by Jesus through a woman named Rhoda Wise. That healing set her life on a course that would ultimately change the world. Learn the amazing story of Rita Rizzo at the Mother Angelica Museum in her hometown of Canton, Ohio. Go to www.motherangelicamuseum.com. Be inspired. Plan your visit now at motherangelicamuseum.com.
Do you have something you'd like to ask our bishop? Most Reverend Daniel Lee Thomas answers questions from our listeners each and every week on the Bishop's Corner. Send in your questions about the faith, today's cultural trends, diocesan news and events, prayer life, anything on your mind. Click the Bishop's Corner tab at AnnunciationRadio.com or on our app and listen for his answer Thursdays at 4:30 p.m., Fridays at 11, and Saturdays at noon on Annunciation Radio.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn, and today we're very blessed to have Carla Broussard. You may recognize Carlo, not only being a native of southern Louisiana, and we got to talk more about your musical career. I've forgotten. So maybe we can dedicate some time to the second half of the show to talk about that. But of course, everybody should recognize your voice and your wonderful personality.
Shayne's about to ask you to play a song for us. So
well, yeah, okay. But of course, your wonderful work in Catholic apologetics, and of course you're a staff apologist for Catholic Answers. You're certainly spending a lot of time traveling the country and the world, giving talks on apologetics, biblical studies, theology, and philosophy. You've also published a number of articles on a variety of subjects in Catholic Answers magazine, and you're a regular guest on Catholic Answers Live, and of course an active writer for Catholic Answers magazine, as well as a number of books. We had you on, I don't know, was maybe 6 months ago?
Back in August,
yeah. So, it's that long now, so it's almost a year. But so we're here today to discuss the new relativism, unmasking the philosophy of today's woke moralists. And we were discussing the 10th topic of your book, and this is the relativism that's plagued the scientific community recently. And I had some comments before we cut to the break, and I was hoping that you could address those comments, and maybe we can take a look at the book. Try to take a quick opportunity, because we've got a little less than 30 minutes here, but we would like to cover the topics of the book one by one and kind of give some highlights of those,
sure.
Because I think this is really important for folks to be aware of, particularly in this woke culture that we have.
Right. Yeah. So just to finish up our previous conversation about the woke moral command of "Thou shalt not be anti-science," we were saying that when you unpack what that means, what is meant by that is you should not reject what those who have an air of authority have to say within medical science. In other words, you need to conform to a particular group of scientists and disregard what other credible scientists say. And that smacks of what we call cultural relativism. There's no truth independent of a particular group of people. So it's groupthink that's driving the car there, right? So what this woke moral command amounts to is there's no scientific or medical truth independent of the consensus of a particular group of experts. And to go against such a consensus is to be anti-science, or as Fauci insinuated, as I detail in my book, to be anti-truth, because Fauci will associate science with truth. And so it's a cultural relativism that's driving things here, and that we must conform to, which is more militant than the old type of relativism. So that kind of touches on the "Thou shalt not be anti-science." And then I give you other strategies as to how to begin refuting this woke moral command, not only exposing it for what it is, a form of cultural relativism, and showing that there's really no anti-science bias going on. It's just contradicting a particular group of scientists. Mm-hmm. I give you other refutations as well.
So, starting with the first the first topic, what advice would you give the average person? Not only well, I just lost my train of thought. Ron, help me.
Well, as we look at how embedded all this is, and how we're so easily swayed by even contemporaries that buy into these wild claims, I don't know if we're starting to stand up now and wake up a little bit. It's funny that we go woke, but we have to wake up from that. You know what I mean? And
right.
I'm seeing some evidence, and maybe I'm just looking for it, but it seems like, when you get into the Targets and you get into the Bud Lights and all that, and what they're teaching, in the curriculum in schools and so forth, at some point people would have to say, "No, wait a minute, I got to stand up now."
Yeah.
Is that happening, or is it just my imagination?
Well, I think the Bud Light and Target examples do illustrate that some people are willing to stand up and try to push back the woke agenda, particularly with regard to the LGBTQ plus community and the lifestyle choices involved within it. Now, these pushbacks are not specifically dealing with these woke commands in the way that I'm dealing with it in my book. It's more of a surface level, like, hey, this stuff is bad, we need to push back, rather than going through it with a surgeon's knife, so to speak, to cut through all of the intellectual confusion and untangle the intellectual stuff and try to expose really what these moral commands are about in order to awaken reason to what it's about, and the hope is to reject it. Now, Shayne, you were bringing up the first topic of critical race theory, thou shalt not be a white supremacist.
Mm-hmm.
In everyday conversation, right, if somebody starts talking about white supremacy and our modern understanding of it within woke culture, the simple question is, okay, well, what do you mean by white supremacy? Well, I give you several different examples from modern institutions who have embodied critical race theory and identify an essential characteristic of white supremacy culture is objectivity, rational thinking. So the common response to that is to say, well, wait a minute. Isn't that assertion rational thinking? Isn't that assertion that white supremacy culture entails rational thinking? Isn't that rational thinking? The claim that white supremacy culture involves objectivity, isn't that an objective statement? Like, do you mean for that to apply to all peoples at all times in all places? And if so, that's being objective. But you just told me that being objective is to be a white supremacist. So are you being a white supremacist?
Yeah.
And so it's a double standard, right? According to their definition of white supremacy, to be a white supremacist is to affirm objective truth or to be objective, right? So they're saying we can't be objective because if we do so, we're oppressing non-white people, hence the woke movement, right? People need to be awakened to the oppression of non-white people in as much as we're saying there's objective truth. So they're saying we can't be objective, but they're being objective in the very statement that white supremacy involves objectivity. And so just a simple line of reasoning like that in conversation with somebody can hopefully awaken reason to the absurdity that's embedded within this particular woke moral command.
Now, you cover many of our modern commandments in the book, in addition to that and science. And I love the fact that you can kind of go back into it and give us the tools. You can not only explain what it is, but how we can deal with that and how we can have a discussion about that. That is so valuable. Take us through some of the other commandments that you kind of tackle.
Sure. So I talk about thou shalt not impose, which on the surface you might think, we shouldn't go and impose our beliefs and lifestyle choices on people. If you mean by impose, like physically coerce them, psychologically manipulate them to adopt our belief system or lifestyle choices. But what is meant by impose within our modern culture is thou shalt not persuade. So rather than hands off, it's more of a minds off. Like, so one comedian within pop culture says we shouldn't even be thinking about gender and sex and homosexuality and stuff. I look forward to the day when we're all equity reigns the day and we're just all getting along, right? We shouldn't persuade other people of our beliefs. If that's what people mean by thou shalt not impose, then we're going to have a problem with that. And ultimately and fundamentally, we have a problem with it because persuading people to the truth is a matter of love. It's a matter of willing what's good for them, namely the truth, that they come to know reality and live and conform with it. And so we want to persuade others to what we perceive to be truth. And rather than that being anti-love, it's actually loving. It's a loving thing to do. Now, there are specific reasons why some people don't think we should go around persuading people. They think it's going to lead to conflict and violence. But listen, we shouldn't give up on persuading people to adopt our beliefs because sometimes it might lead to conflict and violence any more than we should give up on private property and keeping our own land, because sometimes people fight and have conflict and violence over private property. It's not the persuasion to the truth that's the problem. It's the idiots who, it's the people who are failing to persuade people in a charitable manner.
Yeah.
It's the perversion of the desire to persuade to the truth that is the problem, just like it's the perversion of methods of retaining private property. It's people who go about trying to retain their private property or acquire land in a bad way. That's the problem that leads to conflict and violence. So too, it's people who try to persuade others in a bad way. Maybe it's physical coercion or psychological manipulation, which is violating the dignity of the human being. That is the source of the conflict and violence. And so that's just like one strategy that I employ to try to begin pushing back against this woke moral command.
It seems to me, with regard to relativism itself, though, even to persuade somebody is suggesting that they may not have the right thought, that there might be an alternative thought to something, and telling them that they're wrong. If everybody is, if everybody has their own truth and they believe that they're doing the right thing, then to persuade someone to something else suggests that they may not be heading down the right road.
Right. Now, somebody might say, well, given relativism, we ought not to go around persuading people because there is no objective truth to be persuaded about. Mm-hmm. But here's the key. That command itself, that's a persuasion, right? That woke moral command, "Thou shalt not impose" or "Thou shalt not persuade," that's an effort to persuade me of their worldview. So yet again, like in the first one, there's a double standard here. We can't go around persuading others to our beliefs, to adopt our beliefs, but yet others can persuade us to adopt their beliefs. So it's special pleading, we call that in philosophy. It's a double standard.
It's like the new tolerance.
Exactly.
The people that are preaching us, for us to be tolerant are mostly intolerant themselves.
Yeah, so let's actually jump to that chapter. That's in chapter 4. Now that you brought that up, Shayne, mm-hmm. Thou shalt not be intolerant, mm-hmm. right? So we have to ask the question, well, what do you mean by tolerance? Because the positive statement is we should be tolerant. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, whenever you examine the culture and whenever this topic comes up, what is meant by tolerance is that we must accept everyone's beliefs and lifestyle choices as equal and valid. I call this in my book egalitarian tolerance. Every belief is equal and valid. Now, if every belief and lifestyle choice is equal and valid, well, then it follows that no lifestyle choice can be right and another wrong. So that's just moral relativism right there in your face. Once you pull back that veil, it's right there immediately. Mm-hmm. But how do we respond to that? Well, here's one way. According to that definition of tolerance, Ron and Shayne, if you're going to buy into that, well, then you must accept my belief and my lifestyle choice as equal and valid, which involves criticizing lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah.
But of course, you're not going to want to accept my lifestyle choice and belief as equal and valid unless you lose your criticism of me. So you're going to have to hold fast to your criticism and thereby be intolerant, according to your definition of tolerance, of my belief and lifestyle choice. So you become, using you as the target here, if you're in the place of the woke moralist, you are guilty of the very intolerance that you're saying I'm guilty of. So yet again, we have this double standard. According to the woke definition of tolerance, I can't be intolerant of others, but they can. And so this is yet one among many ways in which we can begin refuting this particular woke moral command.
I want to just quickly go back to what Ron said in the first half of the program when he mentioned Pope Benedict's warning that this is a dictatorship that threatened all of our, and we are seeing this playing out. I mean, I don't think I've seen I don't think I've seen such a harsh dictatorship in my lifetime. I mean, you hear of them, you read about, in the history, and you might see little glimpses here and there, particularly in some of the communist regimes or North Korea or something, present day. But it's mostly historical, and yet it's happening right here in this country. So given that, we're actually seeing this dictatorship. They have to advance this through a more or less mob mob tactics to, through the cancellation process through social media. It's even violent in many cases. You have people that get quite physical over this sort of thing. Of all of the chapters, which one do you think is probably the most dangerous or the most prevalent that is I would say universally threatening to us today?
Yeah, I would say it's chapter 3, thou shalt not say he or she.
Oh, yeah.
Dealing with contemporary gender ideology. Whenever I present on the material from my book, without fail, I have several people come to me and explain to me how on the ground at the job place, people are getting threatened to lose their jobs because they are hesitant or outright refusing to call a person by a preferred pronoun. If a biological male is demanding that his coworkers call him and refer to him as she, then these individuals are being threatened with losing their very jobs for not complying to that. Even if to do so would be for that person to go against what they perceive to be reality, to affirm a false reality. And people are coming up to me all the time and say, Carlo, what do I do, man? And so what I do in the chapter is I try to show why the true absolute, if interpreted in the right way, thou shalt not say he or she. That is to say, if a biological male is saying, call me she, thou shalt not say she. And I argue that that is the appropriate right command that we should adopt and follow, rather than abiding by the more woke command of you can't say he if the biological male says call me she. And I give reasons why that is so, precisely because contemporary gender ideology is essentially contrary to reason. And no reasonable person should affirm it, as much as we sympathize with people who struggle and have conflicts within themselves concerning this issue, and our hearts go out to them, and in no way do we criticize their motivations or their culpability for living out these lifestyles. We can analyze the thinking involved within it. And what I show in that chapter in my book is that the thinking involved is really not good thinking, right? It's thinking that violates our reason and our dignity as rational human beings, and thus ultimately cannot lead to authentic human happiness. And in conversations, we need to do what we can, just do our best to somehow expose that bad thinking and share with people like, hey, this is contrary to our dignity as human beings, and we ought not to be approving and celebrating these lifestyle choices, especially saying she when it's a biological male, because that particular pronoun is restricted to affirming a reality that they perceive to be real, and we can't go along with a false view of reality. Well, at least I know in my conscience I can't affirm what is not true.
Absolutely, and that's what they demand. Don't just request, they demand.
That is correct.
And it goes beyond a religious freedom issue. It cuts to the heart of common sense and the human heart. Karlo Broussard is our guest on Faith with Reasons. The book we're talking about is The New Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists, and it's available from Catholic Answers Press at shop.catholic.com. And I know there's an ebook version and a paperback version, so I get both of them. I got holidays coming up. And Carlo, I know the thing that comes to mind when you think about cults, in the past are you think about that cult drinking the Kool-Aid and killing themselves. How do people get brainwashed to the point where they do something like that or change their life so dramatically? But we're seeing this being forced on in a very cult-like way, in a lot of mainstream manners. It seems like all our kids and we're all going to have to be deprogrammed from brainwashing just by soaking in existing culture.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, Ron. But I think the bottom line here is that whoever has the power and control of the common sources of intake of information, they're going to be the ones, and whatever worldview those powers that be embody, they're going to be the ones who shape and form the minds of those who take in the information. And I mean, let's face it, we would do the same if we were in power. We would be utilizing media and streams of information in a way that would shape and form minds according to reality, according to truth, providing them with the proper tools for critical thinking and thinking through the true, the good, and the beautiful, right?
Right.
And hopefully leading them to Jesus Christ. And so those who are in power now, unfortunately, have adopted a worldview that is contra reality. It's contrary to what is true. And so they're using the means that they have at their disposal to shape and form the minds of individuals to adopt their ways of thinking. The problem lies in that many people today, because of swimming in the waters of relativism for so long, I think people just do not know how to critically think anymore and to analyze the information that's being communicated to them through the media. And so what you have is a populace of people who look to those in Hollywood, look to those powers that be who have control of the media as authority. They look to them as their wise counselors. And so they simply follow suit, and they adopt and assent to what those powers that be are communicating. Now, there's nothing wrong with that whenever the authority is appropriate, right? So, like, I'm not a scientist, so if I have a physicist who's telling me X, Y, and Z about the cosmos, I'm going to rationally assent to what they say based upon their credible authority.
Right.
But the problem is that the powers that be who are seen as quote-unquote authorities within our culture are not competent and qualified to be settling issues that are driving our cultural experience, right? They're not competent to be telling us what the nature of a human being is, and the nature of male and female is, and the nature of human happiness is, right? They're simply not competent and qualified to do so. So there is a disproportion between what these powers at be in controlling the media and sources of information and their credentials and what they're giving to us. For example, you don't go to a car mechanic to get information about quantum mechanics, right? Yep. And that's what's happening in our culture today. The populace are going to the pretty people on TV who have control of media, and they're looking to them for information about quantum mechanics when they're a car mechanic, so to speak, to use the metaphor. They're looking to people for information that these people are not competent to be giving the information about. And that's a fundamental problem in our culture, and that's why we see the dictatorship of the woke moral commands running the system and driving the car here.
With just a few minutes that we have left, we've covered probably the what you described as maybe your hottest topic in your book. What's second?
One chapter there is "I shall not be a judgmental, hateful bigot." That's very similar to the intolerant charge. Yeah. But basically, these are just labels to make people look like a bad person for simply having a critical view of certain lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community, saying, hey, those lifestyle choices are immoral and they're not going to lead to authentic human happiness. And simply for saying that, we, particularly as Christians, are labeled as being judgmental, hateful, bigot. Now, what's interesting about that, friend, Ron and Shayne, is that the human behavior can no longer be a target for critical analysis. It is entirely off the table, and all that's left is the person. So any critical analysis of human behavior is seen to be an attack against the person, seen to be ill will towards the person. Therefore, you're hateful. Seen to be a judgment on the motivations of the person, what the person's thinking and feeling, and thus an attack on the person. That's the judgmental charge. Or seen to be simply a biased, negative, emotional reaction to the person. There's the bigotry charge. So it's all about an attack on the person and not human behavior. And that, Ron and Shayne, is the wicked offspring of moral relativism. Because in moral relativism, human behavior cannot be a target for critical analysis. And that's exactly what we see in our culture today. Human behavior cannot be a target for critical analysis. All that's left is the person. Well, that just smacks of moral relativism.
And how timely, too, because look what's coming up here next month, and literally like your backyard here with Dodger Stadium and the promotion with the SPI, because certainly we've got critical thought about what this group is responsible of doing. Every time that they're in public. And yet, we can't say otherwise because, they stand for a marginalized group, and we can't talk about their lifestyle or their blatant behavior.
Yeah, and if you criticize it, you are labeled as being oppressive.
Yeah.
And thus, people need to be awakened to your oppression of this minority group. But notice their spin of oppression is critical analysis of behavior, as opposed to true oppression, which would be unjust, right? Where you're like physically coercing and oppressing a group of people based upon their minority status. So we always have to analyze what modern people mean by oppression. And this is why all of this falls within the broader label of wokeism. Hence the reason why I put it in my book.
Wonderful.
What an awesome book, and what a perfect time to delve into it. And as you point out, the dictatorship of relativism is hiding behind the mask of woke moralism. And when you get into these chapters and you start to dismantle the whole process, it's very, very helpful. Karlo, it's been a real pleasure. And again, the new Relativism, Unmasking the Philosophy of Today's Woke Moralists. I know you can get it on Amazon. Best off to go to shop.catholic.com. A lot of times they'll throw like 50% deals on there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But
absolutely.
If not, pay full price and tip him too, because the book is worth that. So, thank you, Karlo, so much, and continue your great work. I know that the Diocese of Tulsa is really going to enjoy having your expertise as well.
Well, thank you, Ron and Shayne. God bless you both, and thanks for having me on the show.